Great. Thanks, Rabbi Dan. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us. My name is Alan Jacobs, and I'm a member of Temple Sholom, member of the Temple Sholom board, and a member of the Israel Engagement Committee here at Temple. Our small committee has been working over the last couple of years to bring Israel-focused education and cultural programs to Temple Sholom, and in particular in the lead up to Israel's 75th birthday. Among the things that have happened sort of over the last year in this regard are a sermon that Rabbi Brown gave at the high holidays, which then led into a course that she ran around aspirational Zionism. I probably will miss a couple of things which Rabbi Dan can fill us in on. We've had a reading group, two reading groups actually, in the lead up to tonight's session, where we had a substantial number of congregants who got copies of Daniel Sokatch's wonderful book, and we met over the last week in two groups to discuss the book. Going forward, I know we have comedian and educator Joel Chasnoff, who will be here with us in residence to do some education around Israeli culture and society. We're really happy to see such a great turnout for tonight's event. I'm really excited to hear from you and talk with you, Daniel, about your book. And with that, I'll turn things over to Rabbi Dan, who's going to be moderating the conversation tonight.
Thank you so much, Alan. I'm going to remove that and add Daniel. There he is. So good evening, everyone. It's good to see many of you, and I'm so glad that you could join us. By just way of introduction, I want to tell you that I have known Daniel Sokatch for as long as I had contemplated, well, maybe not as long as I had contemplated, but from the very earliest stages of my rabbinate. We were in rabbinical school for a minute, as they say. And then Daniel was smart enough to get out after about 6 weeks or 3 months or whatever it was, because his passion is this work. And he knew that at a very early on in his Jewish professional career. And I've been a real fan and a friend from a distance for over 25, 30 years. And it's a pleasure, Daniel, to be able to welcome you virtually, at least, to Vancouver. We tried to do this in person, but you just came back from Israel. You said today, and you're today. And I know how busy you are because the work that you're doing is really important. So just to share with you the introduction that I've written out here. So Daniel Sokatch has served as the CEO of the New Israel Fund since 2009. During the past decade of extraordinary challenges, New Israel Fund has risen to new heights as the great defender of justice, democracy, and equality in Israel. Before joining New Israel Fund, Daniel served as the executive director of the Jewish Community Federation of San Francisco on the peninsula, which is where I grew up, in Marin and Sonoma counties. Prior to his tenure at the Federation, he was the founding executive director of the Progressive Jewish Alliance, now Bend the Arc, in Los Angeles, where I was. In recognition of his leadership, Daniel has been named 4 times to the Forward newspaper's Forward 50, an annual list of the 50 leading Jewish decision makers and opinion shapers. I've never been on that list. He has contributed articles to leading newspapers and magazines, including the New York Times, Washington Post, The Forward, and Haaretz, and is the author of the book, Can We Talk About Israel? A Guide to the Curious, for the Curious, Confused, and Conflicted, a book that hopefully many of us on this call have read, and if not, we'll still have some copies at the synagogue if you'd like to read it after. Daniel holds a Master of Arts from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and a JD from Boston College School of Law and a BA from Brandeis University. He's married, is a father of 2 daughters, and resides in San Francisco, California. As I mentioned, just as importantly, I've known Daniel since our first days at students at HUC in 1994 in Jerusalem, which, as Daniel references in the book, was quite a formative time to be in Israel. So Daniel, welcome. We're so glad that you're here. Just as a note to everyone that's on our call, if you have questions for Daniel, please put them in the chat. Alan is going to try to moderate those and pass them along to me. And depending on how the format works and how we do on time, if you're interested, I'll ask you to unmute yourself and ask the question. We'll bring you up on camera if we can. just so we can get to hear some other voices and I don't have to paraphrase what you said. But we'll see how that goes, because I have 10 questions, many of which have come from the 2 book discussion groups that we had over the last couple of days. So hopefully some of the questions that I'm going to ask Daniel come from all of you. But really, I guess I'll start, Daniel, with the most basic of questions, and you can take this to wherever you would want. Why did you write this book? Who did you write it for? Who was your audience?
Well, first of all, thank you, Rabbi, and thank you all for being here tonight. Let me apologize in advance if I get loopy. It's just because, as Rabbi Dan said, I just got off a plane from Tel Aviv after an intense. They're always intense, but this was, as you probably can guess, a particularly intense time working in Israel. So if I stumble, that's what I blame it on. And Dan, it's particularly fun for me to do this with you for a lot of reasons. Obviously, because we're old friends, but also because of what you said. That time in the mid '90s, the early mid '90s, the mid '90s, really was a halcyon time in Israel, a golden age, and I feel like it has motivated me for as long as I've been doing this work, that vision of what could be, and that notion that there is a path that's different from the one that sadly I feel Israel and the region have been on for too long. So seeing you also reminds me of that time. So it's very nice. Why write this book? Right, because there are a lot of books about Israel. So why do you need another one? My wife is an author, a real author, and so we have sort of friends who are also real authors, and for years they've been utzing me, you should write a book about Israel, and when they would do that, I would say to myself, sure, if I wrote a book about Israel, can I engage in a mild implied profanity? Not an actual profanity. I said if I was going to write a book about Israel, I would call it Israel WTF. And if you don't know what that means, someone in the chat can tell you. Why one small country drives so many sane people bonkers. That was sort of my jokey title to myself. Because what I meant by that, as a person who's devoted, I've devoted my entire adult life to working and fighting for this notion that the vision enshrined in Israel's Declaration of Independence, that there should be a place in the world that is a homeland for the Jewish people, and also a beacon, a free and equal democracy that treats with total equality and fairness all of its citizens. That's been the sort of compelling, motivating sort of light in my professional life. Here's where you can make the joke about, that maybe wasn't the smartest goal to pursue for your entire career, but I still believe that. And so when I thought about this idea of writing the book, I thought, there is a lacuna, right? There's one area where something seemed to be missing. And that's because although there are so many books about Israel, they tend to fall into 2 big categories and then one tiny one. And the 2 big categories, well, the first one I would describe as what they taught us to call in law school advocacy pieces, right? That is to say, books that are intended to advocate and create empathy or sympathy or support for one of the positions in the debate around Israel. And because this is a home crowd, right? We know that sometimes people who are looking into this conflict think of they think of 2 sides, right? Israel and the Arabs, or the Palestinians, or the Jews and the Arabs. And of course, what we know is there are many sides, and neither of those 2 sides is a monolith. Right? Each of those, and if you ever needed evidence of that, look at the Israeli press or the coverage of Israel right now today. There is no single narrative when it comes to the Israeli side, nor is there one when it comes to the Palestinian side, or any of the things, the camps that are looking from the outside in. But still, this first big category is made up of these books that are really not intended to do what I wanted to do, right? Because of course I do have a position that I'm advocating for. I try to be quite clear about that. But that is that in order to productively engage with this topic, you need to A, know what you're talking about, and B, hold with empathy and compassion all of the parties to this conflict. And again, that's my belief. You don't have to agree with me, but that's really what the book sets out to be. In that sense, it's an exercise in what I think of as radical empathy, right? Trying to really understand what I believe to be the completely legitimate connections that both of the peoples in this conflict have to this place, and the totally legitimate histories of trauma and dispossession that exacerbate the conflict and connect these folks to this place. So I didn't want to write an advocacy piece, or if I did, it was an advocacy piece on behalf of humanity and compassion and empathy. The second big category of books, well, I have them on the bookshelf behind me, and I bet if we could see the Rabbi study, we'd see them as well. And these are books. They're fabulous and useful for the most part, but they're books by experts for experts, or by scholars and specialists for scholars and specialists. And while those are very important and very useful, they are not accessible, right? So if the first category of books is by definition not even-handed, it's not attempting to really unpack and understand what makes this conflict and the parties to it tick. The second category has no interest in sort of being something that we could just pick up and read. And that made me think of that third category of books. When we were young, Dan, all those years ago, living in Israel, right? I remember someone turned me on to a book by the Israeli author called David Grossman. And it was called The Yellow Wind. And it was a piece of nonfiction. And Grossman, Israel's most celebrated living novelist and a peace activist, had written this book and another one called Sleeping on a Wire, where he went out into the field and spoke in the first book to people living in the West Bank, and in the second book to Arab citizens of Israel. And it reminded me when I read that book of sort of the greatest of all of these books for me, the late great Amos Oz, Israeli novelist and peace activist, and I should say, International Council member of the New Israel Fund, who wrote a book called, he wrote great fiction, wonderful novels, but he wrote a book called In the Land of Israel, where in 1982, he sets out and sort of takes us on a journey across Israel, talking to all kinds of people, explaining all kinds of positions, and that book, more than anything, sort of it provided me with a sort of literary GPS device to help me navigate the conflict. And a few years later, I read Thomas Friedman's From Beirut to Jerusalem, and it did the same thing. And many of you may be familiar with Ari Shavit's book, My Promised Land, which I think is another version of that. And I thought, every generation needs a book like that to help navigate the conflict. And while I don't in any way, shape, or form compare my effort to those great books, I did feel that there was a contribution to be made, a sort of literary GPS device for people trying to navigate these issues with compassion and insight today. And when I thought of my audience, to finish my long answer to your excellent first question. Well, it turns out that's the first thing a publisher asks you as well. It's not just Rabbi Dan who asks you. Publishers say, "Well, who are you writing this for?" And without trying to be glib, I really meant what I wrote in the subtitle of the book. It's a guide for the curious, the confused, and the conflicted. And I absolutely count myself amongst that camp, right? But for all of us who don't feel comfortable accepting the orthodoxies of any of the political sides, for all of us who recognize that if you're going to talk about Israel, and for that matter, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, then you have to accept that you're dealing in grays and nuances and different perspectives and different understandings of the same sets of facts. The book is really intended for those people. It is, which makes it easy, right? Because it's not actually intended for those folks who know what they know. This is not a book for them. And one of the things that's been most interesting in the book tour, you were talking about how you've forgotten Zoom already. One of the silver linings of this whole period, well, one, I finally found the space and time to write this book, but two is I've done probably over 100 book talks because I do them from the office or from my room, and I've gotten to talk to people all over the world, right? In non-Jewish but mostly Jewish audiences, and especially in North America and in the UK and in Australia. And what I find is, people who the vast majority of people answer affirmatively to the rhetorical question I pose in the title, right? Can we talk about Israel? Well, it turns out we can. And if we sort of open our hearts a little bit and accept that we might not always agree and are civil, we really can have these incredible conversations. And I can count on one hand the number of times someone who falls into the camp that I described before, the ones who know what they know. They know one side is right and the other side is wrong. Those people are really not my intended audience. I'm happy to talk with them, but you don't usually get too far with people like that.
So just building on that, Daniel, I mean, it would seem to me, having read the book, that your intended audience is this group right here, is the Jewish community. I mean, when you were writing this, you were writing it largely for the Jewish community. Has there been uptake in the Palestinian Arab community or in other, sort of allied communities, if we'll say, of the peace movement of, reading your book, in the depth and detail that we have? And then I'll add to that, because it was my next question on the list. What's been the hardest thing in your book to convey?
Interesting question. Well, the first answer is I've done a lot of let's call them non-Jewish book talks. For example, we have, as I'm sure you do up there, we have all kinds of sort of civic organizations that sponsor readings, foreign affairs clubs and different sort of literary or intellectual societies. Especially in cities like San Francisco and Boston, and I'm sure Vancouver. And so I get invited to do a lot of those, which I love doing. And this one has been really moving for me. Quite a number of talks in the Christian world, growing numbers. And we sometimes think of the Christian world, as well. We don't think it's monolithic, but we don't really understand it that well. Even living in countries like Canada and the US, where we're, in the midst of largely Christian countries, I don't think, at least you're probably different given the work you do and the coalition work that you've done for years. But, I know the difference between Roman Catholics and Episcopalians and Presbyterians, but the book has, we often think when it comes to Israel, there are sort of, maybe two sides in the Christian world, and then a big empty middle. And the side one are the evangelical fundamentalist dispensationalists who are quite right wing when it comes to Israel. I have a chapter about them in the book, and in fact are when people talk about the Israel lobby in the United States, and I don't expect that all of you are too familiar with that, because why would you be? But you probably heard the term AIPAC, right? The American Israel Public Affairs Committee. AIPAC has not for many years been the most powerful Israel lobby organization on the sort of conservative side in the United States. Rather, it's Jews United for Israel, CUFI, which is an evangelical dispensationalist lobbying organization that boasts millions and millions of members and supporters, and they support, a theologically ordained vision of an Israel in which, this is my editorial opinion, we, the Jewish people, are sort of bit players in their big end times apocalyptic story. So you got that on the one hand, and then a much tinier group that we're familiar with here, and I'm sure you have in Vancouver and elsewhere, are groups that really identify, and sometimes, and I know, I imagine you might have questions about this later, right? They identify very much with the Palestinian struggle and can often be incredibly insensitive and unaware of the Jewish or Israeli side of the story. And I kind of thought that was the whole, that was the whole world. Well, it turns out I was dead wrong, right? Because there are many, many American Christians who feel about Israel the way that many of us do, perhaps not with the same intensity and the same ethno-religious emotional connection, but who really are compassionate people who sort of reject those dichotomies. They don't accept that end times theology of the dispensationalist evangelicals, nor do they accept the Israel is always wrong belief of that small group. And I have been invited to speak to many of those groups, and that's been incredibly interesting and quite rewarding to see that we have a lot of allies. I say we, sort of talking about the way that our movement of Judaism, the Union of Reform Judaism, the New Israel Fund, that universe of perspectives, which we may not all share on this call, but I certainly do. There are a lot of allies out there. In answer to your question about Palestinian groups, I've spoken to many Arab and Palestinian Americans have attended these book talks, especially in that last category I described. But I haven't done any book talks with Palestinian groups, nor with Israeli groups, other than the ones that I work directly with. And when I was in Israel just now, I did an interview with the Ma'ariv newspaper, a large Israeli daily, and among other things, they asked about the book, and they said, "How come the book has not been translated into Hebrew? It's translated into Japanese." Oh, look at this, you guys! I just got the Portuguese one. It came when I was away, and look what they put on the cover: a drawing from I have a very talented artist friend, and here's just one of the illustrations on the book, which shows a guy hoisting a Palestinian flag over the separation barrier, as opposed to the actual cover of the book, which is just this beautiful picture of Jerusalem that he drew. And the publisher said the Portuguese publishers, they called the book Israel in Portuguese, and they said, look, this is very blunt and it's not a North American perspective, but if we want people to understand that you are sort of a guy making telling a story with compassion about both sides, and the book is called Israel, we have to show in Europe that you have sympathy to the other side, which I thought was such a fascinating and really it was a real insight into the European challenges with wrestling with this issue. We think it's tough as North Americans. Well, there, God forbid you should be seen as being too pro-Israel. So that was just fascinating to me. But the guy from Ma'ariv says, why has the book not been translated into Hebrew? And I said, well, honestly, that's a question that you have to answer, right? The book's been translated into all kinds of languages. And I said, but when Ari Shavit wrote My Promised Land, I'm not sure that ever was translated into Hebrew. If so, only very recently. And he's an Israeli. And, I said gently, I love this place of yours, this country. I've devoted my career to it. But it's not, and you are often you are very sensitive to the way you're perceived in the outside world, but you're not deeply curious about what other people think about your country. I mean, that's a brutal generalization, but the fact that Ari Shavit's book went for a decade before anyone was interested in translating what he wrote about his homeland into Hebrew, I think is indicative of something. And the same can be said of the other party to the conflict when we reduce it to that level. The Palestinians, they're not all that interested in what outsiders have to say about their conflict. And if I'm honest, I think that's a mistake, right? I think, I don't know if any of you had to read, I can't imagine why, de Tocqueville, right? This 18th century French intellectual who comes to the US and travels around and writes about it and becomes this phenomenal bestseller. And even in today's crazy United States, people are interested in foreign perceptions of the country. And that's not so much the case in Israel, where they're sensitive to it, but not deeply interested. So that's something I didn't expect when I started writing the book. Sorry, so I went on for a long time there. The second part of your question was really about what, would you repeat it?
Yeah, it was just, and then we're going to move into the tachlis parts of the conversation, the book. But what was the hardest thing, I guess, to convey? If there was a message that you kind of hoped or struggled to be able to articulate?
Yeah, look, I think one of the best way for me to answer that question is to tell you quickly the funny story of my two favorite critical comments that were made about the book. The book, I'm very happy to say, was really well received and well reviewed, and that's gratifying and terrific. But I remember doing a podcast in the UK, which brings us back to the question of how Europeans, and by their own definition, they're no longer fully Europeans there, so it's a different perspective. But I did this podcast with this very British host, who again mostly liked the book, I think, but he at one point said, your book is annoyingly even-handed, and I sort of thought, guilty as charged. And I appreciated that because that was difficult, right? Being even-handed doesn't mean that one has to engage in moral equivalencies where they're inappropriate. Being even-handed doesn't mean that you don't love your people, right? Being even-handed means you try to walk in the other person's moccasins or sandals, right? You really try to feel and understand why they feel as they do about this place that we feel so strongly about. So that was difficult, and that was criticism number one. And the other difficult thing was criticism number two. The book got a great review in the New York Times Sunday book review, which down here, that's what you're looking for. And my mom, if I do nothing else in my life, that was enough. This really good review ended with the following critique. And again, I embrace it, guilty as charged. And he said, At the end of the day, though, the author doesn't offer solutions. Rather, he only offers reasons for hope. And once again, exactly right. So, I was concerned that the book not be one that people could then say, oh, here's the pat, easy solution to the conflict. Because, my friends, there isn't one, not right now. And I wanted, I wrestled with that, because if you tell a story, you sometimes reach a place where people draw certain assumptions about the story, so that, oh, so you believe X, Y, and Z. Well, I do believe plenty of things, and I'm happy to share them, and I share them in the book. But I don't think I never wanted the book to seem like it had the answer, because that would be facile, and that would be dishonest and insincere. And I liked getting that little ding by the reporter in the New York Times, because it was evidence that at least hopefully I succeeded in trying to provide people with reasons for hope and engagement during what is often a really difficult time to wrestle with this topic.
And we talked about this in sort of before everybody joined us, the challenges and the hopefulness of this particular time in the Israel that you just came back from. And we're going to talk about that in a bit. But I do want to kind of dive in a little bit. You very thoughtfully give a lexicon of terms, and you acknowledge that these terms are loaded. In any Israel conversation and dialogue, the use of them will often project which side of left, right, or fence or whatever you are on, and they themselves can be weaponized. West Bank settlements, occupied territories, Judea, Samaria, all those kinds of things. It came up in one of our book groups, in one of our discussions, the use of the term militant and terrorist in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Could you define those terms for us?
No one's ever asked me about those. I get asked about the terms all the time. And by the way, my 20-year-old university student, she said, "Hey, Dad, the lexicon is really great. Why did you have to write the rest of the book?" Like, that's just like all you needed was. So there you go. They keep you humble, your kids. So in that case, look, I don't know that I have and I don't think there is a terribly scientific distinction, but I can certainly tell you what I mean to say. And I also think that there's an area of overlap. And I also think that what is a truism is that one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, right? So that the Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, two men who would become prime ministers of the state of Israel, led two groups. Begin's group was called the Irgun, and Shamir's Etzel, or the Stern Gang. These would be, by our definition, terror organizations. To wit, Begin blew up the King David Hotel, murdering scores of people, including local Jews and Arabs who were just working there, as well as the Brits who had their military or their headquarters in the hotel. Shamir's Etzel stormed into a village, an Arab village, Palestinian village, on the hills leading up to Jerusalem, where today, interestingly, there's a mental hospital, and they massacred hundreds of women, children, and old men. And these men became prime ministers, right? Yasser Arafat led the PLO, which would hijack buses and airplanes and murder civilians, and he ended up being the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization to the president of the Palestinian Authority. So one person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, and when you catch someone in their career, or when a conflict at a certain point in its development, things change from being seen as terrorism to being seen as something else, and vice versa. Again, as I said, it's all about the nuance. Having made that point, for me, right? And by the way, obviously, that distinction goes for everybody everywhere around the world. Catholics in the north of Ireland didn't think of the provisional IRA as terrorists. They were freedom fighters. And people in Britain and Protestants in the north thought of them as terrorists. I don't need to keep making these analogies because you totally get what I'm saying. For me, terrorism is, for me, defined as violence against civilians, and there are no cases in which I, Daniel, think that is morally or politically acceptable. Full stop, period. I had the honor as a young man to meet a guy called Kazik Rotem, who was one of the survivors of the Warsaw Ghetto. I don't like calling them survivors; they were fighters. He was one of the surviving Warsaw Ghetto fighters. He was the guy who looked Aryan. He was 17 years old, so he was sent out of the tunnels through the tunnels, through the sewers, and he got a truck. And at the end of the day, his job at the end of the uprising was to try to rescue the surviving fighters and get them out, which is what he did. And he got to Israel and lived a life. He died a few years ago. We remained close for years. He was an unbelievable, heroic figure in our people's history. And my eldest has a necklace he sent her from Jerusalem when she was born. But Kazakh told me, his name's Simcha Rotem, his nom de guerre was Kazakh. He told me after the war, he was assigned by the underground a mission, and what they were going to do was poison the water supply in, I don't remember if it was Frankfurt or Hamburg, a big German city. And they got the poison, and they were going to do it. And at the last moment, he thought, I can't do this. Right? Like, as guilty as some of these people are, there's children, there's teenagers, there's old people, there are people who you know, and he couldn't do it. And he said, because anytime you ever take, do this to non-combatants, it's terror. And I follow in the footsteps of Kazakh Rotem. That's terror. When I use militant, and again, I think that someone, like, we're people, we make choices. Right. So saying an organization is a militant one or a terror one, those are challenging. The organization Hamas in Gaza, to go right to the heart of the matter, right, is a complicated one, and it has a sort of a military wing and a civilian wing. I guess you could say the way that the early Jewish pre-state Yishuv organizations sometimes did, or the way that Sinn Féin and the IRA in Northern Ireland, to go with my older analogy, my other analogies, did. So Hamas has sort of a governing civilian wing and a military wing, a militant wing. When that militant wing engages in battles with Israeli troops, when the IDF goes into Gaza or fires on Gaza, when they fight each other, I would say those are combatants fighting each other, militants fighting each other. When they lob missiles at farming communities and Tel Aviv, those are terrorist acts. So I would define them by acts as much as anything else. Now, you may not agree, and that may not be popular. In Israel, if there is a firefight in the West Bank between IDF and Palestinian gunmen, it's always terrorists shot at the soldiers or soldiers shot at the terrorists. And I think that's an inaccurate description. When people target civilians and murder them, it doesn't matter who they are, right? It doesn't matter whether you're a Palestinian gunman who shoot two kids in a car a few days ago outside of Nablus, or if you're settlers, 400 settlers who rampage into the village and torch 100 buildings and kill one guy, and that's terrorism. Both of those are acts of terrorism. So I probably have gone into, see, one of the things that was great about the book is I got to do that. I got to go into detail about things that are provocative and that get used, as you said, weaponized. So there you have my deep thinking on terrorism and militant.
Thank you, Daniel. I do want to remind folks that you can put questions in the chat, and I'll do my best to incorporate them or bring you on screen to ask them. So I want to move to two other words. It's the A words, right? So apartheid and anti-Semitism. You talk about them in chapters 20 and 21. These are some of the most I'm going to read what I wrote because it was a long question. These are some of the most controversial, contentious, and complicated places to poke around in when you're talking about Israel. Can you talk a bit about how and why you approach them in these two terms, and why you think they're so hard for people to talk about, one or both of them, anti-Semitism and apartheid? And I'm going to ask a related part to that. This is a little longer. You make the case that fundamental criticism of Israel's existence as a Jewish state should not be labeled ipso facto as anti-Semitism, given the real and large moral cost that Israel's existence as a Jewish state has meant in practice for Palestinians. And you seem okay with, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but my take was, with some pretty fundamental inflammatory questioning of the whole Zionist project by Palestinians and their allies, namely BDS and the idea that Zionism is a colonial enterprise. At the same time, you don't deny that some of this criticism is motivated by anti-Semitism. And this came from one of our book groups, and I'm incorporating it, and I've experienced it in my rabbinate as a practical matter, and I'm thinking now particularly about our teenagers and young people on university campuses, where they encounter many people calling into question the legitimacy of Israel, the legitimacy of Zionism, equating Zionism with racism. How do we allow for open discussion that may include very deep criticism of Israel and its institutional arrangements, without also legitimizing the expression of anti-Semitism or anti-Semitic sentiments? That could have been.
I'm smiling only because just a little easy, simple question for me to answer. So there's like 4 questions in there. I'm gonna try to break them down. I really will try to be pithy. And if I'm forgetting something or if you want to redirect, do so. I don't know that I can do honor to all of these things. So let me try to do it quickly. Why do I deal with these controversial terms? Because you said why and how. I deal with them because they're out there, right? We can stick our head in the sand and pretend that the conversations about BDS and apartheid and all the other terribly difficult things to wrestle with are not happening, or we can label them all as anti-Semitic, bringing it round to the anti-Semitism thing. But that's not accurate, And man, you guys were lucky to be in Canada. I thought a lot about Dan during those 4 years, but one of the things that it really did. Like any struggle, it does make you stronger. And there was a senator from New York called Daniel Patrick Moynihan, I quote him in the book, who famously said, every man is entitled to his own opinion, but not his own facts. And so you have to break these terms down, because otherwise we're just guided by opinions. We're not actually looking at the facts. So that's why I dealt with them, because they're there. Because Dafka, like the beginning of your long question, it goes to the end. I have a junior in college, right? I have had to equip her. Well, I've had to work with her. She's really smart, to equip her to be able to deal with the discourse that goes on, which on college campuses in the U.S. anyway is a big fight between Israel is always wrong and Israel is always right. And so how do I help, how does the daughter of the New Israel Fund CEO navigate a place where our family, we love this place? Her name is Noah, right? And we don't accept either, we reject that false dichotomy. So if you don't engage these tough things, and if you don't really unpack them, even when it's uncomfortable, and if you don't actually accept that maybe the orthodoxy that we received is not the total story, I'm not doing her any favors. I'm just setting her up, So can we take one of your examples, and I'll try to go deep rather than quickly touch on all of them, and then if you can redirect me however you want. Apartheid. It's out there, my friends, as you know, the term. And what I used to say, and you know what? This was the easiest chapter of the book to write, because it's the one time where I took a thing that I say often in public and just transcribed it, basically, with a caveat. And there's a caveat on the book. Hey, come on in. Oh my gosh. You have to understand, we knew each other when we were totally unformed people. So like every time there's a hint of our lives now as grown-ups, it's just so cool to see. How old is that one?
That's Esty. She's 11.
Amazing. All right. I have an 18 and a 20-year-old now. So okay, so let's take apartheid. So what I wrote in the chapter, and what I'll say right now. And by the way, I did a really nice interview. I enjoyed it with the Toronto Star. They did like the cover of their Sunday magazine, and the pull quote, the headline was, "My answer is not a soundbite," which I thought was a great description of the book, and hopefully me, because of this issue. And it was written about this, what I'm about to do now. She wrote that about what I'm about to tell you. So we hear all the time the question, and I'll bet you do too, is Israel an apartheid state? And so here's my answer to that question. And I want to remind you that there's a caveat. There may be 2 caveats right now, but we'll come to that. What I traditionally say when I'm asked that question is the following. If you give me a group of intellectually honest left-wing critics of Israel, they don't have to be left-wing, critics of Israel, and you let me take them up and down the length and breadth of the state of Israel within the Green Line, that is within the 1948 armistice borderline between Israel proper and the West Bank, right? And you let me introduce them to all kinds of people, Jewish and Arab citizens, religious and secular people, immigrants from Ethiopia and Russia, and veterans who have lived there for ages on the kibbutzim or in the moshavim. If I get to introduce them to people living in the cities in the center, as they call it, or on the periphery, way off, in the outskirts of the country. If we meet judges, and we meet business people and academics and artists and lawyers and students, at the end of the day, when they see this country, they will see a country that, much like my own, and probably to a lesser extent yours, right, struggles with what it means to be a democracy and a country for all of its people, and a place that really serves one of those groups. I think in that sense, you guys are in better shape than a lot of our countries, right? But in the U.S., you'll remember, Dan, we have a constitution that says beautiful things, but in the Constitution, when it was ratified, it excluded a group of people from those beautiful things. So there are lots of democracies that, like Israel, in its Declaration of Independence, which sets forth the beautiful vision I said earlier, there are lots of countries, and Israel's one of them, that don't always live up to that. And in fact, that have clashing narratives of what the country ought to be. And there are people in Israel, a lot of them, who don't want to see that kind of Israel. But that is the Israel that the founders set out to build. And if you spend time in Israel with me, my left-wing critical friends, and you see that there are even now laws that make Arab citizens of the state kind of second-class citizens. The 2018 nation-state law is a great example. That is nothing more than a stick in the eye of 22% of the population, just to remind them, in my opinion, that they don't really belong. But then in the same breath, you see that there's an Arab justice on the high court. And in fact, when Israel's former president, was accused, convicted, and sentenced after a rape trial, it was an Arab justice who sentenced him to jail. And if you see that up until a year and a half ago, the third largest party in the country, political party, was a largely Arab party. If you see all of the amazing shared society organizations that NIF is proud to support, working to build a truly shared future for Israel, you would, if you were intellectually honest, have to admit that despite racism, and in both explicit and implicit, and institutional and personal, there was also an incredible dynamic democracy that was moving towards always one step forward, two steps back, a future of equality, often challenged. But whatever you saw was in no way, shape, or form resembling apartheid in South Africa. Now, if you give me a similarly intellectually honest group of right-wing defenders of Israel, and you let me take them up and down the length and breadth of the West Bank, and we talk to Palestinians, almost 3 million of whom live amongst now almost 750,000 Israeli settlers, if you count the area east of Jerusalem, which was unilaterally annexed and expanded to and called Jerusalem by Israel, but no one else in the world recognizes it. That's almost 750,000 Jewish Israelis who now live over the Green Line in settlements that are a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention's prohibition of moving your civilians into conquered territory. Again, whatever you think of the settlements, that's what the legal advisor of the Knesset said to the prime minister in 1967. We can't build civilian settlements because it's against the Fourth Geneva Conventions. If I take you up and down the length and breadth of that territory, if you see how the Jewish Israelis living in these settlements outside of Israel have opportunity and access to transportation, electricity, not to mention the vote in Israel. They don't live in Israel, but they vote in Israeli elections. They can travel at will. They're protected by an enormous armed presence. They receive a completely inequitable, they receive much more. There's an inequitable distribution of land, water, electricity, building permits, and most strikingly, perhaps, if you see that the Palestinians who live in that place, who are people of no country, if they're tried by Israel, are tried in military courts, whereas their neighbors are tried in Israeli civilian courts. If you see how settlers have a network of settler-only roads and tunnels and infrastructure connecting them to Israel, well, if you have a blue Palestinian license plate, you can't access those roads, often going right through your village, right? And if you see that all of this is based on an immutable characteristic of birth, the accident of who you happen to be, you would be hard-pressed to say, especially when you see the checkpoints that keep Palestinians not only from coming into Israel proper as the settlers go back and forth with impunity, but from going from one Palestinian population center to the other with impunity. By the way, the border between the West Bank and Jordan is not patrolled by Jordanian and Palestinian Authority border guards and army and police. It's Israeli and Jordanian. Total control of Israel. It belongs to Israel, of who goes in and who goes out, right? You know, the horrifying raids and counter-terrorist reprisals that we've been seeing these last few weeks, They're all happening in the part, sometimes people will say, but Palestinians have the Palestinian Authority. Well, that's Area A, right? During Oslo, the West Bank was divided into the Oslo peace process. It was divided into 3 administrative territories, areas A, B, and C. Area C, which is where all the settlements are, Jewish settlements, is over 62% of the landmass of the West Bank. And that's totally controlled by Israel. Every aspect is controlled by Israel. Area B is less than 10% of the land. And it's where most of the Palestinians live. It's because it's the cities. And officially, the PA, the Palestinian Authority, has police and garbage collectors, and they're providing services, mail services. Well, the currency in all of those places is the shekel, and all of the violence that we've seen, all of the IDF raids are into Area A. So the IDF and the Israelis operate with total impunity in those areas. If you see all of that, you'd be hard pressed to say that what you've seen doesn't resemble some of the more pernicious aspects of apartheid. Now, my former board chair, Talia Sasson, who was herself the Solicitor General of the State of Israel, an aide to Ariel Sharon, of all people, she was asked years ago by an Israeli paper, would you say that we're an apartheid state? Is it apartheid what's happening in the West Bank? And her answer works for me, although less and less. And what she said was, it's bad enough what it is without referring to inaccurate historical analogies. It's bad enough what it is. And I still believe that. But here's caveat number 1. Caveat number 1 is everything I just said is about a description or a comparison between apartheid era South Africa and current realities in Israel and the West Bank. But over the last couple of years, starting with Israeli human rights organizations, mind you, and Israeli legal officials or legal experts, and then spreading out to international human rights organizations, the conversation isn't so much anymore about a comparison. It's about an international law that was that was put in place by 2 treaties, one in the 70s, one in the 80s, that are treaties against. They describe an international crime against humanity called apartheid. Is it a shame that it's called apartheid? I suppose, but that crime has 3 elements. 1, a state controls a territory in which it promotes one group over another based on immutable characteristics of birth, ethnicity, religion, race, whatever. 2, it creates systems in order to promote that superiority. And those can be legal systems, like trying people in different courts, or physical systems like roads and infrastructure for only one of those groups, or military infrastructure. And 3, it engages in what the treaties call inhumane acts in pursuit of 1 and 2. And those are described as restrictions on freedom of expression, on freedom of protest, on freedom of movement, right? The checkpoints, the fact that Palestinians cannot gather and protest, right? And for example, collective punishment, which is also illegal under international law, like destroying the home of a family of a terrorist, right? If all those boxes are checked, then that is by international law called apartheid. And so caveat number 1 is we've moved past the question of the comparison to South Africa, which Talia and I think is imperfect, to the question of what is Israel doing in the West Bank? Is it, in fact, the crime against humanity of apartheid? And I'm glad I'm not a person who has to argue in international law courts about this, because there's no way I could argue that what Israel is doing in the West Bank is not those things. Now, the second and final caveat of this deep dive into the thorniest of all these topics is the current coalition agreement of the State of Israel's government, which, as you know, is not exactly having a very easy time of it right now, for good reason, includes a provision to annex the entire West Bank. Now, it then says that if you annex the West Bank, which if you're Bibi Netanyahu, you've had your whole career sort of thinking, why buy the cow when I get the milk for free? But now you're in bed with radical right-wing ethno-nationalists. This guy Smotrich, who said today that the town Huara, where the 2 boys were murdered by terrorists, and then people rampaged into the town, 400 settlers, burning it and terrifying people and killing one. This guy Smotrich said today it should be erased from the map. Now, Israel should erase it from the map. He's the finance minister of the State of Israel. He has said we have to annex everything. If you annex everything and you don't give those people the vote, then what do you call that system, right? So I would say Israel's, I do have a lot of things that I'm hopeful about, which hopefully we'll have time to talk about. But I think Israel's heading in a dark direction in this regard. And so it's tough, right? My answer is not a soundbite. There's no pithy way to sort of answer that question. And if what I said troubles or upsets or angers you, and I get that it might, I would go and really look closely at everything I just said, and figure out how you come out on it. So, and when it comes to anti-Semitism, I'll just say this. My friend Rabbi Jill Jacobs who runs an organization called Trua, a rabbinic human rights organization, wrote a great piece in the Washington Post a few years ago, which I actually quote in the book, where she basically gives us the tools to be able to figure out when criticism of Israel is really anti-Semitic. And you guys know the tropes. Israel controls the banks. Israel controls the world. Us, the people on this Zoom, we're responsible and culpable for everything Israel does. And everything bad that happens in the world is something Israel does. Like, you know the tropes. There's a lot of them. But when an American congresswoman says, I think we should cut U.S. aid to Israel, because her grandmother lives on the West Bank. She's a Palestinian American, right? And she says, I don't think we should support Israel. And if you ask me, I think Israel should just be a democratic state where everybody gets the vote. I don't think that she's anti-Semitic. Is she perhaps insensitive to Jewish suffering and history to a certain degree? Perhaps, but also she's looking at her life and her lived experience. Ben Gurion himself was who could be brutal in pursuit of his vision of a homeland for the Jews, of a Jewish state, said, and I quoted in the book, this one really pisses off a lot of folks on the right. Ben Gurion, the George Washington of Israel, says, yes, there was the Holocaust. Yes, there was anti-Semitism. But what is that to them? All they know is that we have come here and stolen their home. And Jabotinsky, the father of right-wing Zionism, wrote, he said, the Arab natives will resist us like any native group would resist a settler enterprise. So now we get furious when people talk about a settler enterprise. That's what the Zionists understood. Of course, that's what they were. But they weren't a settler enterprise of England or America or France. They were a settlement enterprise of the Jewish people, which had legitimate, real connections and roots to that place. So you can't fit a square peg in a round hole all the time. Right? It's back to Talia about apartheid. It's an imperfect analogy. Okay, there.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you for that answer. And I think that the poll quote is exactly right. It's not a soundbite. And like all things, I hate to complicated is not an excuse for things, but it is a starting point of this. This is more than a tweet. This is more than a soundbite. It takes nuance and understanding, and we don't get that very often. And in your last little bit actually brings me to the last question I wanted to ask on sort of the problematic things, and then I want to turn to one more problematic thing, which is what's going on today, and then hopefully, though your book doesn't offer solutions, it does offer hope, and where you see hope and hopefulness, and we have a question or two about that in the chat. But the other question I want to ask, and this is one that truthfully 10 years now in Canada, now as a dual citizen, a Canadian and an American citizen, has had more resonance for me than I think it did at any other time in my life, which is one about Indigenous claims. And you kind of touch on it there, and you talk about it in your book, and I think it's very interesting. So I think that an argument that resonates with some Canadians, I'm not going to say all of us, is one of Indigenous peoples and a claims to Indigenous lands. And it seems by your description, at the very least, both groups can make a valid claim to Israel-Palestine being Indigenous land, and that they seek to return or a restoring of what had been theirs, in some cases going as far back as biblical times. And you talk about the challenges of who are the Canaanites and who are the Philistines and all of that. So do you think that both of these claims are equally valid? And what is the just resolution of these competing claims? And I'll just add, because you brought it up, for me, that this is not a claim that starts in 48 or even in late 1800s in Zionist Congress, but this is this is a claim that we could trace all the way back, the hope of 2,000 years and before that, at least from the Jewish perspective. And I learned a lot more about the Palestinian narrative from your book as well. So if you could tackle the Indigenous question.
Yeah, when it comes to this, I think the question of indigeneity is often a red herring. Like we all on this Zoom call live in countries where most of us, certainly me, I don't know about all of you, and we're a wonderful melting pot, each of us individually. But most of us don't have real claims to indigeneity in our North American countries. We know who was here. Most of us also weren't the people who displaced them. Whether or not we benefited from that is a whole other set of questions. But it's not the case in Israel or Israel-Palestine or the Promised Land or the Holy Land or whatever you want to call it. And so, yes, I do think both sides have equal claims. And I spend time in the book, as you said, really trying to trace them for people, my readers from my own beloved Jewish community, to give a sense of understanding of the Palestinian claim, and for people who aren't from the Jewish community to give a sense of our legitimate claim and ties. So yes, I absolutely think both sides have legitimate claims. Do they have equally legitimate claims? For sure, right? And certainly now. But again, and you can't believe, well, you can, because you're asking the question, like the industry on both sides trying to obviate those claims. One of my favorite chapters in the book to write was the chapter you're kind of referencing now, which is about this issue, and it's called "The Map is Not the Territory." And it sort of looks at the ways that both sides try to obviate the existence of the other. And I'd like to even go deeper into the claim of indigeneity, although I touch on it. I'm looking at lots of other things as well, ways that we try to negate the presence of the other. But here's the thing at the end of the day that I think is most important. There's a false claim out there that you hear from people all the time. There's no such thing as a Palestinian people. Palestinians are a modern day invention. By the way, to a certain extent, that's true. The Palestinian national movement was in response to Zionism, which was also a modern 19th century national movement. But the links of these people and the reality of their presence in the land, of course, goes back. But you sometimes hear the people we call the Palestinians today came 200 years ago from Saudi Arabia. I kid you not. That's a thing people say. It's nonsense, of course. But let's say for a minute it's true. Right. And you sometimes hear Palestinians and others engage in the fallacy that Jews have no real actual connection to Israel. And they'll go through all kinds of contortions to show that the people who say they were the Jews aren't really those Jews. Now, it's ridiculous, of course, right? Our DNA tells a totally different story. Even people who look like me and you, Dan, you check our DNA and it's similar to that of Levantine people. So both of these narratives that are meant to undermine the claim and connection of one of the parties to the place, they're both BS, right? But let's say for a second, for the sake of argument, that they're not. Let's say that we have nothing to do with the people who lived in the land 2,000 years ago. And let's say the Palestinians of today are, instead of who they really are, which is ironically sometimes a bit of us, right? They just walked in from Saudi Arabia on their camels and donkeys 200 years ago. Let's say both of those claims are true. You are not going to convince a Palestinian that she doesn't have a connection to that place because she's lived there for hundreds of years, or because she lives in Canada, right? She's in Alberta, but her family and her grandparents and her great-grandparents were from Jenin. You are not going to convince her that she doesn't have a connection that she has. And you are not going to convince me, no matter who you are, even if I didn't know that it's BS, right? That I don't have a connection to this place, that the place over there is not the place that my people have for thousands of years said we want to return to and held up as a vision and an idea, right? You're not going to convince me and the woman from Alberta, and we don't live there. So do you really think of the 11.5 million people who live between the river and the sea and who have for a very long time at this point in time, it matters at all if you manage to somehow argue that your connection isn't real? You can't convince someone that what they feel is not real, because what they feel is real. So hey, there's a pun there, Israel. So that's what I have to say about the ridiculous argument of indigeneity. If I were one of the people making that argument from my own community, I would be deeply embarrassed. It's so obviously facile. And it's funny, right? This is the thing that gets me most exercised, as you can tell.
Right.
Because this notion that we can delegitimize the other and then, what is that going to get you? You can make yourself feel better, but you're not going to change the other guy's mind and heart. So it's like a complete waste of time.
Thank you for that. So I want to turn to what's going on today. And I think about it this way, every time you buy a new car or you get a new piece of technology, the moment you open the box or drive it off the lot, it's already out of date. And your book was written, a couple of years ago, I guess, at this point. And much has happened as is wont to do in that region. It moves very quickly. And what is happening now with the new government, and you talked a little bit beforehand about just having been there, can you give us an update on, sort of the state of things? And here, and I shared this with you a little bit. So the new Israeli government has really exacerbated or brought to the surface these deep divisions in Israeli civil society. We talk a lot about, and I don't exclude Israeli Arabs from civil society, but here we're talking about Israeli civil society and even divisions in the Israeli Jewish civil society. And I would argue that the current government, maybe like all governments, exploited those divisions to gain power. Nonetheless, Israel has seen hundreds of thousands protesting in the streets these last couple of months. Not about the treatment of Palestinians, although you raised something that I want you to speak more about when we were talking, and not entirely about the treatment or rights of Arab citizens, but about the fundamental Jewish character of the state. So what does this all say about the state of Israel and the state of the current Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And to the extent that you think that it's relevant, the way the Abraham Accords may have been or is changing this dynamic. And then we're going to move to hopefulness and where you see places for us as a congregation, as a community, and as people that care about all these things, where we can do work to help.
Great. And it's in 7 minutes. Look, the only thing I would disagree with in your characterization of the situation is that I don't think the hundreds of thousands of people who are out in the streets are talking about the Jewish. I don't think the divisions are about the Jewish nature of the state. I think those protesters are there because this government has declared war on the democratic nature of the state.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for the correction. Yes.
That is the word on the streets. I mean, literally, it's demokratia. It's democracy. The people of Israel feel quite correctly that this government has set out to turn Israel, which you don't need me to repeat it because you had my long spiel about inside the green line Israel and how much I love all those imperfect things about it. They're trying to turn it into something that looks like Hungary, right? Or Erdogan's Turkey. Now, lest you think that I'm exaggerating, that's where the Likud goes to learn. Orban and Bibi are very close, right? And they believe they have set forth their in the coalition agreement. They set forth their policies and their goals, and they want an Israel. What's the linchpin of the protest about democracy? So it's about democracy, and what's the linchpin? It's about the attempt to eviscerate the independence of the Supreme Court. And there they engage in disingenuous arguments. Our system would then be like Canada's, and you wouldn't argue that Canada's a problem with the override clause, which is one piece, and with the selection of justices, which is the other big piece. It would be just like America. Well, Israel's not like Canada or America. Israel has no constitution, written or oral, and Israel does not have a, however battered and tested, centuries-long democratic and pluralistic tradition. And most importantly, Israel does not it has a weak set of checks and balances. My country held together, it got pretty close to the edge there because of the intricate checks and balances that the founders and the framers put into the Constitution and put into the system, including, by the way, federalism, meaning that no matter how bad things got, this is my opinion. If you like Trump, you're entitled to your opinion too. No matter how bad things got in Trump's Washington, there's only so much he can do to California, right? We there are some things, but my kids, the public schools that my kids go to, the Secretary of Education has very little to do with what they learn. And Roe v. Wade is overturned, but it's strongly protected under the California Constitution. And you can't have concealed guns and automatic weapons whenever you want them in California. You can bring them in from Nevada, but that's a different story. So Israel has none of that. It doesn't have the traditions of our country, however shaky they may sometimes seem. It doesn't have the protections of the country. And that's precisely what the government wants. And the government wants that because it's made up of, let's just call it 3 blocks, right? Block number 1 are radical ethno-nationalists who want to annex the West Bank. Don't believe me? Check the coalition agreement, right? And they do not intend to give any rights to the Palestinians living there. And as I said, there's a word for that. We've already discussed it. It's not a Hebrew word, it's an Afrikaans word. The ultra-Orthodox blocs want the ability to override the Supreme Court's decisions that, for example, recognize conversions that you would do, right? Or that recognize the legitimacy of our Jewish roots, all of us on this call, right? And who want very much to ensure that any of the tiny little gains that we may have gotten in Israel through work of the Israel Reform Action Committee of Reform Judaism or the Masorti movement or Women of the Wall, that those are eradicated and that they retain total control. And the third block, let's call them the, I'll use the term that the protesters use, the crime minister block. Benjamin Netanyahu has been indicted on 3 serious counts, and he's involved in a glacially moving trial, and he's facing jail time. And he needs the Judicial Selection Committee to be under his total control. Right now, he wants it to look like ours in America, where the ruling party picks the judges. And let me tell you, terrible idea. The way Israel does it now is a really smart idea, right? And he wants that override clause so that if the Supreme Court says, no, you can't, you've been found guilty, you're going to jail, you can't be prime minister, his parliament can just overrule it. So those 3 blocks have a completely different vision of Israel than the ones that almost all of us on this call, and thank God, about 66% of Israelis, according to a poll that was done last week, have. So even that means that the election was almost 50-50, right? It was decided by a few tens of thousands of votes. But huge numbers of people who voted for the parties of the coalition do not agree with the, quote, judicial reform, which, as you see in the Israeli press, is referred to as a judicial coup, right? When I was at the protests on Saturday night, they think there were about 200,000 people there. The first speaker was Ehud Barak, former prime minister, and he said, we may have to engage in mass civil disobedience, like Gandhi, like Martin Luther King. The next speaker was our beloved Rick Jacobs, my friend, the president of the U.S. wing of the reform movement, URJ, and a former board member of New Israel Fund. And he spoke in totally credible Hebrew, by the way, and said, we, the liberal Jews of the world, stand with you, the protesters, in defense of that vision of Israel. And then, most shockingly, the security chiefs, former head of the Mossad, former head of the Internal Security Agency, saying, if this government manages to successfully shut down the Supreme Court, pilots refuse to fly, reservists refuse to serve. So we are at an extraordinary, unprecedented moment right now. And at the same time, the West Bank is spiraling into horrific violence. And the fact that you've got a finance minister who's the head of that first faction, the ultra-nationalist pro-settlement group, bloc, who is now demanded and received control of civilian aspects of the West Bank, right? In other words, the Israeli military is supposed to control what happens in the West Bank, but not anymore. So and you can't make it up. The guy who said that Harawa should be wiped off the face of the earth is the guy in charge of civilian infrastructure in the West Bank right now. So Israel is at a boiling point. And yet, I got home at 6 o'clock in the morning, and yet, there is something going on that is sort of incredible. And in a sense, it reminds me of the Women's March here or the color revolutions in Eastern Europe. But Eastern Europe is not, Israel's not Hungary and it's not Poland, right? On the one hand, it doesn't have the benefit of being in the heart of the EU. On the other hand, it's got 75 years of democratic fiber. It doesn't have hundreds like we have. And look at these people, these beautiful people, right? They're absolutely saying, not in my name. They're out there every weekend in the hundreds of thousands, and something quite amazing happened. Now, I'm a glass half full kind of guy, but one of the things that we saw, they've done something kind of astonishing. You walk into the protest, and I don't know if you've been watching the coverage or any of you have gone. What do you see? What's the symbol that people are using? It's the flag of the state of Israel. Hundreds of thousands of Israeli flags. They've done something that no protest movement in America has ever been able to do, which is reclaim the symbol of the country for themselves, right? And the second thing is, in today's protests, I don't know if you saw, but for the first time, Israeli police turned fire hoses and stun grenades and tear gas on the protesters in Israel. Israeli protesters in Tel Aviv. First time that's ever happened. And later that night, it turned out that someone found out where Sarah Netanyahu, who is a very unpopular figure in Israel for everyone, she was getting her hair done in Tel Aviv, and protesters found out, and suddenly thousands of people were chanting outside of the hair salon. And when the police stormed in, hundreds and hundreds of police, you can see this on Twitter now, the crowd waving Israeli flags, they did something that changed what the rabbi said in his introduction. Because you're right, they were talking about democracy, and they weren't really talking about equality for Arab Israelis. And many of my Arab Israeli friends and colleagues have been frankly afraid to go to the protests because they're not left-wing protests. They're left, center, and even right-wing protests. And they use the symbol of the state. And many of the Arabs, Israeli citizens felt unwelcome. But slowly, they're starting to come, and we're supporting efforts to bring them there. But tonight, but it's not been about the occupation. It's not been about the West Bank. But tonight, the protesters, in their thousands, as they were confronted for the first time by police who were stun grenading and tear gassing and fire hosing them, they chanted, "Efo itchem b'Harawa?" Where were you, the police, in Harawa when for hours settlers raged and rampaged? This was a broad cross-section of the Israeli public. Now, I don't know where things are going, and I know we're running out of time, but let me bring you up to where we are. Where we are is the Knesset. I met with our U.S. ambassador, I know that you guys are not U.S. citizens. The U.S. ambassador, when I met with this week, and he said, he was quite worried that that the right wing's offer of negotiations for compromise was disingenuous, and the left kind of saw, Lapid and Gantz see, it's kind of like Roe v. Wade with the Democrats here in America in the midterms, if you followed that, right? Like they see political power in this. This is so unpopular. What the government is doing is so unpopular that that they're going up in the polls, and look who's coming out on the streets, right? The Mossad, the Shin Bet, the Air Force pilots, the high tech, the finance, the shekel, by the way, is in free fall. And I know this because we buy shekels to give to our grantees, and suddenly I'm able to buy a lot more shekels for our grantees when we get donations from New Israel Fund. All of this is leading somewhere. No one knows what's going to happen, but here's where it's leading. The ambassador said he was concerned that Bibi, who is very much aware that he's in enormous trouble, right? By the way, the State Department in the United States said of Smotrich, who is headed to the United States now, the finance minister, his comments were repulsive and disgusting. So, like, Bibi, that's what they said about his finance minister. Bibi hasn't been able to, by the way, condemn what he said yet. He won't do that. So I'm going to tell you where things are headed, and I'll leave you with what I think the scenario is, and then quickly reasons for hope, just because I'm cognizant of our time, right? The Supreme Court, the High Court of Justice, is the target of many of these new laws that they're pushing through. Also, nonprofit organizations and who is a Jew and all that. But it's really aimed at the Supreme Court, because if you get the court, if you do to the court what was done to the court in Russia, Poland, and Hungary and Turkey, right? In a way, Turkey's the best example because they had a longer stretch of actual quasi-democracy than Hungary or Poland, but still never like Israel had. If they do to the court what they've done in those countries, the democratic game is over. Israel is now what is referred to by Viktor Orban as an illiberal democracy. It's majority rules, no rights guaranteed for minorities, and no judiciary to say that the government has gone too far. So it's not a democracy, it's something else. So those laws have passed their first reading. And what the ambassador said to me was, I'm worried Bibi now thinks, well, screw it. I got trouble for this at home and internationally. I may as well just push it through now because I got the 63 votes. If that happens, and I would say it's the most likely scenario, although I don't have a crystal ball, then those very laws that would strip the court of its independence will by design have to be reviewed by who? The Supreme Court. And the conventional wisdom is that this court, who has the president of the court, the Chief Justice, is a strong figure. She and the Attorney General, interestingly also a woman, have been really resistant to the pressures of Bibi and the hard right wing. And if this court rules that these new laws are unconstitutional, there will be a full-blown constitutional crisis at hand in Israel. Already, we're in a crisis in Israel. Because then the question is, who is going to obey? Who will the security services and the police obey? Will they obey the court that says this is unconstitutional, or the government that says, no, don't listen to the court, they don't do their job anymore? Now, the majority of thinkers think that the security services will obey the court. Now, what happens if that happens? That's what I leave you with. That's sort of where we are now in Israel. You can't. It is as dramatic and uncertain as any moment in the history of the state of Israel. The reasons for hope, in addition to what I just said to you about the fact that the Israeli public, it turns out, is not willing to go the way of countries that have seen their democracy slip away from them, and they're fighting ferociously, and they're organized. How long they can last is unclear, but that is a reason for hope, right? There are 60 some odd percent of the Israeli people. Look, they don't agree with me, all of them, right? But the fact that some of them now have been moved to make a connection that they wouldn't have made 2 months ago. Wait, the police protect Sarah Netanyahu, but they let radical settlers who want to strip our democracy away terrorize innocent Palestinians in the West Bank. That's something's happening in the political consciousness of the place. Now, if we step back from the current moment of crisis, my optimism comes from my deep well of Jewish pessimism, but also from my 14 years of running the New Israel Fund, because below the headlines, right, beneath the radar screen, there are tens of thousands of people. And now we can see, right, it wasn't tens of thousands, it's hundreds of thousands. But there are tens of thousands of people who really do believe as we do, right? Again, I'm making an assumption about you all because you're part of a reform shul in a liberal North American city, and I apologize if I'm making assumptions. But the vision that those Israelis have is that vision of the 13th and 14th paragraph of the Declaration of Israel's Independence. And they're, by the way, Jewish and Arab alike. There are Arab Israelis who will say, I understand why Jews are frightened. This is their home. And there are Jewish Israelis who say, I would stand in the way of people trying to dispossess my Arab neighbors of their home. Now, that's the community that NIF supports. And those are the organizations that we fund and that we strengthen. And you have to be made of tougher stuff than I am if you can go into that place, which is literally and figuratively burning right now. And if you can spend a week with our grantees, with our activists, with the people who are trying to build a truly shared society, who are going to the court to fight for people's civil rights, who are working with Bedouin women so that they are economically empowered and not trapped in the patriarchal, system that they grow up in, who are working for LGBTQ Israelis so that they can, both Jewish and Arab, so that they can, they can make manifest. Israel's got a good reputation for LGBT rights, but talk to our activists. They'll say, not because the government was so nice that they gave us anything, we clawed every one of those rights, right? There is this unbelievably vibrant civil society in Israel, people and organizations working to realize the dream. And that's what gives me hope.
Wow, Daniel, I am so glad you didn't become a rabbi, because you are such the voice and the vision and the leadership and the wisdom that I needed to hear in the midst of all that's going on. And I'm so glad that our congregation could hear it as well tonight. Thank you so much for what you've shared. I think there weren't hardly any questions in the chat, and I think that was largely because you were really speaking to all the questions that we had, not because I had such insightful questions, but because you understand where we're at and the struggle that we're all facing right now, in our kishkas, inside of us. Thank you very much. We, as a congregation, will not only continue to do education, but we're going to provide opportunities for us to get involved with New Israel Fund of Canada and with the Israel Religious Action Center, the Reform Movement. We've had Anat Hoffman here before. We've done other things in the past, but we're going to do that again and continue with our educational work with the Hartman Institute and with others. Thank you so much, Daniel, for being on this call with us tonight. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. The recording of this will be up online by tomorrow, probably, so I hope you'll share it with other members of our congregation and within your social circles so that people can get this insight and this information. Any final comments, Daniel, anything?
I'll just say thank you all for being with me tonight. I owe you one because I'm trying, I'm trying not to fall asleep too early because so my wife said it's perfect. You have a reason to stay up. So I feel like after 9 o'clock I'm free to go to bed. And also, it's been years since I visited you up there, and I appreciated the invitation this time. I'm glad we did it on Zoom, but when my youngest goes to college in the fall, invite me up. The Seattle and Portland NIF chapters are already planning to bring me up, and I'd love to come visit again and see you all in person.
We would love to have you. Alan, anything, I had you in our script, but I don't know if there's anything you want to say closing out for our engagement committee? You're on mute.
This was really wonderful and really enriched. I read the book cover to cover, but it really even deepened my sense of your thinking as you wrote the book, and I've learned so much from both the conversation and the book. So really appreciate your taking the time to be with us.
Thank you.
Thank you. If anybody would like to join our Israel Engagement Committee, you can send an email to myself or to info@templeshalom.ca. And we would love to grow the group and get additional voices and ideas. Thank you all so much. Daniel, get some sleep. I hope to see you at some point soon. And to everyone, have a wonderful evening.
Good night.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. Really learned so much. Thank you.